And the kids are dismissed at this point. If I want to follow Mr. Fuzzy out the back. All right, everybody else? How you doing? You okay? Good. Did you have a good week? Everybody feeling comfortable? All right? I feel like we've got a lot of material to cover this morning. That's why I'm asking. Are you comfortable? Are you cozy? Is the temperature right? Do we need to make it a little cooler or anything in here? No? Cooler? Cold? Oh, it's too cold. Sorry, Annabelle. I was telling the worship leaders, or I said to the staff, I said, I fear this is going to be a longer sermon, so just be prepared. Anyway, but here's why. Basically, because I think that what we're talking about today is one of the more important topics, questions, issues that we're going to look at this summer. If you're new with us, we're taking a break from our normal pattern in sermons over the summer. Instead of working our way through a book, we're doing more of an apologetics series here, where we're looking at difficult questions or more objections that people raise against Christianity, against the church, against Christ, and we're trying to consider those things, consider ways of meaningfully engaging them and having meaningful conversations, right? And I guess it was about a month or two ago, I was taking the girls and we were driving somewhere, and I asked my girls, I said, what are some of the objections or issues that your friends or people in school or the people that you know outside of the church have, against Christianity? Because I wanted to hear from the younger generations, what are some of the issues, and we can consider that. And both Megan and Callie, I don't know if Kate, you were in the car, but I don't know if you engaged it too much, but Megan and Callie both said very clearly, it really just comes down to that they think that Christians are bigoted towards homosexuals and members of the LGBTQ community, that we are prejudiced against them, that we are antagonistic towards those individuals. And I was striking, and when I asked them, I said, okay, all right, Ford, I'll write that down. What else you got? What other questions? They said, well, that's pretty much all we hear. That's what keeps coming up over and over, which was striking to me for a couple reasons. One, as I said in the very beginning, it's interesting how some of the main objections and issues and questions change through the generations. That probably would have been an issue in my generation or in the millennial generation, but not the dominant one. But then it was also striking to me because it got me asking the question, how did that happen? How did it come to be that this younger generation, at least the ones that my daughters are associated with, have come to view Christianity, the church, perhaps even, sadly so if that's the case, Jesus himself, as being antagonistic towards or prejudiced against or bigoted towards homosexuals or members of the LGBTQ community, right? I would imagine that part of that is perhaps because, well, just as a culture, we have moved sexual identity into like a core component of who we are, and anytime culture is not affirming core essentials of who we view ourselves as, well, that's a little bit problematic for a culture. Or maybe part of it is that, hey, there was a period of time not too long ago where members of that community were treated very harshly by those in the church and outside of the church, and so now anything that smacks of antagonism towards that is just kind of viewed in a very negative way. But there is a part of me that wonders if part of the reason that the culture has things is that maybe, I say it this way, I wonder if the church, by and large, at large, has done a good job of adopting the ethical stances of Jesus, but maybe not so much, at least on this particular issue, the way or the method that Jesus goes about living out his ethical standard, trying to influence a culture in ethical standards, trying to effect ethical change, if you will. In other words, if I can be so bold, I would say that maybe in the church at large, there are some who could be commended for adopting the ethical stances of Jesus, but maybe need to repent over the ways that they have lived out, gone about engaging culture with that ethical stance. And so here's the thing. Again, I feel like we've got a ton of stuff that we could talk about today. I feel like all week the preparation for this sermon was more a matter of chopping and splicing and getting rid of stuff that I would love to talk about. So we can continue this conversation well beyond this. But for today, my interest is simply this. Big picture, I want us to see Jesus this morning. That's my main goal. If you happen to be on the outside looking in, curious about Christianity or the church or about Christ, and you're curious about it in relation to this question, I want you this morning to see Jesus. I want you to understand who he is, and I want you to understand where he's coming from when he starts talking about issues of sexual ethics. And if you are those of us who have entrusted your life to Christ, and have you committed yourself to following after him, I too want you to understand very clearly who Jesus is, what he's saying, what is his stance on certain sexual ethical issues. But I also want you to see how he stands on those issues, and I want you to think very carefully with me this morning what it means to take our stand with Jesus in the way Jesus does on these issues. Okay? So that's what we're looking at this morning. I think it's a very important topic for us to consider and to think very carefully about, not just today, but on into the future, clearly, because a whole generation has already developed views about the church, about Christianity, about Christ, based on this issue and how we go about this issue. So that's part of my goal this morning, help us to see Jesus. We're using this conversation that Jesus has with the Pharisees as our primary means of doing that. We're in Matthew 19, but we are going to be looking at Mark 9 as well, too. It's the same conversation over there, so maybe if you have your Bibles and you're following along, you get ready. I'll tell you why a little bit later. But here it is. Jesus is on a journey at this point. He's with his disciples, and he's moving from Galilee into Judea, ultimately en route to Jerusalem. And as he's on this journey, he comes across a group of Pharisees who always have this little game they play where they try to ask Jesus some question, try to trip him up, try to get him to say something wrong or compromising, try to discredit him somehow with, his followers or the culture. And so they ask him this question. They say, hey, Jesus, we got a question for you. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? We're not told explicitly why this is such a ingenious test. I don't know. You would think it's a pretty simple answer. You think Jesus would say no. Probably part of the issue is that the Pharisees maybe are trying to get him into some political hot water, because maybe they know that Jesus might say no here, but maybe they have in the back of their mind, hey, I know Herod and his household. There's a lot of sketchy divorce and remarriage going on there, and you remember what happened to John the Baptist when he decided to speak up about some of that stuff. He lost his head. So, hey, Jesus, what do you think? Is it all right for a man to divorce his wife for any reason, for any occasion? Jesus seems not concerned about the test. He doesn't seem worried about what's going to come as a result of it. And so he gives them this answer. He says, well, haven't you heard? From the very beginning, God made them male and female. And he said to them, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and he shall cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. They no longer will be two, separated, but they will be one. So therefore, what God has joined together, let not man tear apart or separate. Okay? Okay, so a couple quick preliminary things that probably should be brought out here for Jesus when it comes to sexual activity, when it comes to marriage and oneness, all of this, right? For Jesus, these are not human inventions. Right? It's very clear. For Jesus, these are God inventions. These are things all the way back in the very beginning that man just didn't decide to come up with. Hey, it would be great to, find a nice, lovely lady and, go at life together. No, this was God's intention. It was his design. It was his creation from the beginning. And it was something for which he had specific purposes. Right? There was a specific design to this. He was aiming at human flourishing. He was also aiming at the mission that he had called men and women to together inside his creation. Okay, but fundamentally, marriage, sexuality, all that for Jesus, this is God invention, which differs from the way maybe we in our broader culture would view these things. These are things that we design and we give our intentions and purposes to, and we craft and we go out about how we want to go about it. Okay, so that's one distinction. Another distinction here for Jesus very clearly is that for Jesus, sexual activity, oneness, and lifelong fidelity or lifelong faithfulness to that oneness, all three of those things go together. He can't imagine them in any way distinct from one another, which again is very different from our culture. On the broader cultural level, all three of those things have been, just chopped and split apart. Sexuality, sexual expression, oneness, marriage, and lifelong faithfulness. Those are all three separate things that may or may not relate to one another. In the broader culture, for Jesus, they go hand in hand. Right? He can't envision sexual activity outside of this lifelong, covenantal relationship of marital oneness. Okay? So again, we're just highlighting some things about Jesus that are different from the way our culture might perceive these things or on a cultural level. Okay, but here's the thing. This hasn't even touched on the really radical part yet. The really radical part is what comes next. See, as often happens in these conversations between Jesus and these Pharisees who are trying to trip him up, Jesus is really skillful at flipping the tables or putting it back on them in such a way that they're all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute. And that's what happens here. Jesus says, so what God has joined together, let not man separate, period. And they say, well, wait a second. Why did Moses say then, it's okay to divorce and give her a bill of divorce and send her on her way? See, because here's the thing. In that day and age, divorce was a common thing. It was common, I should say this. It was common for a man to divorce his wife, not necessarily the other way around. It was common for a man to divorce his wife, and there may or may not have been a legitimate reason for it. It could have been stupid reasons. Guy could come home from work, long day at work. Wife makes him a nice cheesesteak dinner. But she makes the mortal mistake of instead of using an Amoroso or a Licio roll, she gets a cheap knockoff soft, crusty roll from the ShopRite bakery. And the guy says, I don't know how many times I have to tell you this. This isn't working out. And you pack the bags and you're out of here. Where a guy on a Sunday afternoon wants to watch football games. You got the 1 o'clock show. You got the game of the week at 4 o'clock. And then you got Sunday night football at 7 o'clock. And the wife comes to him and says, honey, you're only home, 1, maybe 2 days a week. The rest of the week you're out working. And it'd be nice if we could just spend some time together. If we could just kind of, talk maybe a little bit on this day off that you have. And he says, babe, I love you, but this just isn't working out, all this constant nagging to spend time and to talk together. I'm sorry, you got to go, right? This was a common thing. The divorce, it was quite common for a man to just divorce his wife because he found her unsatisfactory for some reason or one reason or another. And Jesus says, no, you don't do that. And the Pharisees are saying, well, wait a minute, why does Moses seem to say, send her on her way, give her a certificate of divorce, which is a sketchy reading of Deuteronomy 24 at best. But Jesus says, he didn't even engage that. He just says, because of your hardness of heart. This is not the way it was supposed to be. But it's of your hardness of heart that Moses commands you to give her a certificate of divorce when you send her on her way. I tend to be of the persuasion, as do a lot of commentators, that the issue here is that, hey, in an ancient patriarchal society, when a woman gets cast out of a home, she's in a very vulnerable and precarious situation. Right? That's not the culture we live in today, where women can be very self-sufficient and all that. In an ancient patriarchal society, if a woman is cast out of her home, that's a dangerous place for her. For a woman in the ancient patriarchal society, her well-being, her care, her protection, her financial security, all of that was directly associated or connected to her male protector, provider person. Whether that was her father, her husband, or maybe her son. And so if a woman gets cast out of the home, and maybe if her father has long since died, she's in a really precarious situation. And no other guy is going to bring her into her home because the best they know, she's the property of some other guy, and that would be committing adultery if I bring her into my home. And so as protection for her, you got to write her a certificate of divorce so that she can go around and say, no, I'm not anymore bound to this former man. He has divorced me, has sent me on my way so that she could be brought into another home. Right? In other words, you see, because of your hardness of heart, Moses had to say, hey, make sure you send her a certificate of divorce on her way. But this is not the way it was supposed to be. Your hearts have grown hard. You've long since rejected what God's original intentions were, that a man and a woman would leave and would cling to one another and become one flesh together in this lifelong covenantal union. So what man is joined together, let not separate. And so he gets really radical in that culture, and he says, I tell you this, any man who divorces his wife for any reason outside of sexual adultery, essentially saying for any reason apart from her joining herself in oneness with some other man, anybody who divorces his wife for any reason apart from that is committing adultery. And part of the reason I wanted to read Matthew picks up the nuances of the conversation. You can see how radical this was because of the reaction of the disciples. The disciples say, if that's the case, well, it might be better if I just don't get married. Right? If that's the case, this no-fault divorce is a problem, I'm not sure I want to lock myself in here. Okay? Now, all right. We all with me here? You see what Jesus said? You see how stark this is? I want to broaden this out. I want to put this conversation in its broader context a little bit because I want you to see something else here about Jesus. And this is where I would have you, if you're going to follow along in your scripture, I would have you do it in Mark's gospel. Matthew picks up the nuances of this conversation, but Mark is a little bit easier for picking up the broader context. So I'm going to be flipping over to Mark 10. There's the exact same, essentially same conversation. But I want you to see Mark 9 through 11, or the beginning of 11. Mark 9 is Jesus' transfiguration, which is essentially his full glory being revealed and put on display to his disciples. They're up on a mountain. His face and his likeness, it becomes transfigured, is radiant, full of glory, and this voice from heaven declares, this is my son. Listen to him. This is the one. This is the one you've been waiting for. This is the messianic Messiah, king. Listen to him. Right? And then interestingly, okay, right, so then if you look at chapter 11, what is chapter 11 in the beginning? It's the triumphal entry. It's the entry of the king to the royal city of Jerusalem. Okay, so you have two kingly passages, but then right in between here, 9, 10, and 11, basically what 9, 10, 11 are, or 9 and 10 are these conversations that Jesus is having with his disciples as they're walking to Jerusalem about what this kingdom is like and about what he as king is all about, and they're having a hard time getting it. It doesn't fit their categories. So like, for instance, if you were to look at that transfiguration scene, immediately as they start coming down the mountain, Jesus says to them, hey guys, don't tell anybody about this until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. And the disciples they're kind of curious about what not curious about the resurrection from the dead. They're curious. You can tell the wheels are spinning in their head because what does he mean? The Messiah, the Son, and is somehow going to experience death. Like what in the world? That's messing with our categories here. They come off the hill, and instead of having some royal banquet or royal dinner celebration, the very next scene is Jesus going and having compassion on a young boy who is afflicted by an evil spirit that causes him to convulse in seizures. And Jesus comes and he casts out that spirit from him. And then Jesus has a conversation with the disciples. He says, guys, remember, the Son of Man must be crucified and suffer death. And these guys are saying, what in the world is he talking about? And then they're walking a little bit further. This is still in Mark chapter 9. And Jesus hears some talking behind him. Turns around, what are you guys talking about? Finds out they're talking about, well, I wonder who's going to be the greatest when we enter into the kingdom. And Jesus says, you guys are missing it here. Whoever would be first among you must be last. There's a couple other little episodes there at the end of Mark 9, which maybe we'll come back to if we have time. But if you look then, just no case in the beginning of Mark 10 is that same conversation about marriage and divorce. And then after Luke 10, or after Mark 10, continuing on in Mark 10, the next major scene is a conversation with the rich young ruler, where the rich young ruler is coming and saying, making sure all his bases are covered, saying, hey, how do I get in on this kingdom that you're bringing about? And Jesus sizes him up, asks him a few questions, and then says, hey, why don't you sell all that you have and give it to the poor? And the guy, is, what is this guy talking about? And he leaves kind of sad or discouraged. And then we have another episode where Jesus says to his disciples, I'm telling you, the Son of Man is going to have to suffer and die, and they're still all scratching their heads. And then we have another episode where the disciples are sort of bantering about greatness and power, and you have James and John who come to Jesus and say, hey, Jesus, would you do us a favor? Jesus says, yeah, sure, what? When you get into your kingdom, can you sit me on your right and sit my brother on your left? The positions of privilege and power, authority, whatever. And Jesus says, you guys, you don't get it. You don't know what you're asking for. He who would be greatest among you would be a servant. He who would be first among you must become slave of all. And then you get chapter 11, entry into the royal city. But do you see what's going on here? Do you see that there is a fundamental difference between the way the disciples are going at life and the way Jesus is going at life? All right, for the disciples, they're really excited now about following this Jesus because it means kingdom, and it means power. It means the fulfillment of all their longings and desires and dreams and all of this. And for Jesus, the summary verse is actually Mark 10:45, where he says, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's the summary statement. And that's exactly what's going to happen after Mark 11. Why is Jesus going into Jerusalem? It's not to seize the palace, take over the positions of power and authority, but it's to give his life away. It's to surrender his life for disciples who don't quite get it. It's going to be crying out, Father, forgive them, while the Roman centurions are thrusting spears into his side. He's giving his life in love for Pharisees who don't see their need for him and are always trying to trip him up and bring him down. He's giving his life in love so that mercy might be shown to sinners and to adulterers and to liars and thieves. Right? In other words, this is Jesus' whole agenda here. Jesus' whole agenda is not to be served, but rather to come and to give of himself in sacrificial, self-donating love and service to others to the end, to the very end, as far as you can go, to the experience of death itself. Right? So you see that context, and now you put this whole marriage discussion into this context. And now you see very clearly, well, of course Jesus would say, no, you don't divorce your wife for any reason. Because here's the name of the game. Certainly if you're a follower of me, it is living this life of self-donation, self-sacrificial love to the other. That's what I'm all about. That's why I'm here. And see, look, this is what I can't stress enough, that this is the real radical stuff. This is the stuff that is so fundamentally different from the way, as a culture, we view sexuality, love, relationships, marriage. Right? In our broader culture, those things, sexuality, sexual expression, love, relationships, marriage, these are fundamentally acts of self-fulfillment. We engage in those things, we do those things so that we can satisfy deep longings, deep desires, deep needs that we might have within ourselves. Dare we say, as some have often said, that we go at relationships and marriage as consumeristic enterprises. We commodify the other, we use them to satisfy, to fill up, to fulfill deep longings, emotional needs, and desires that we have. And as long as we're able to do that for one another, things go great. But the moment one doesn't live up to their end of the bargain or it's not working out, we'll quickly move on to some other sexual partner or some other relationship or some other oneness that will better fulfill all of that. Jesus is coming with a fundamentally, radically different approach to life. No. I'm not here for self-fulfillment. I'm not here for self-realization, self-actualization. I'm here for self-emptying, for self-donation. I am here to give of myself without limit to the very end in love and service to my people. And so here's what it means to be my people and go at marriage and relationships. You do the same thing. All right, I feel like we could talk about that all day, but big picture of that. For Jesus, marriage, sexuality, all of this, not human invention, divine invention with specific purpose, specific aims, goals. They all go together: sexuality, oneness, lifelong faithfulness, right? All divine design. And these things are representations in a way of the love that he has, the love that he is living out, the love that he is showing. Okay? And so look, if you're on the outside looking in, considering these things, and you're wondering about Jesus and his, if he's antagonistic or bigoted towards, whatever, like, make no mistake about it. If you would choose to entrust your life to Jesus and to commit yourself to following him, he would ask of you that you submit your sexual desires, your sexual identity, your sexual needs, whatever, all of this, your dreams, goals about marriage. He would ask that you submit all of that to him. And he would ask that you hold as a greater value God's purposes for all of these things. And he would ask that you hold a greater value his example of self-sacrificial, self-giving love. Right? And if you are looking at that and you're having issues with that and your problems with that and you think, well, that's whatever, then my challenge to you on the outside would just be to get to know this Jesus. Read more about him. Follow him. Listen to him. Look at how he talks and has conversations. Look at what his life is aimed at. And you'll see that this is just a fundamentally different way of going at life. And it might be worth considering. Okay? All right, quickly here. I told you, I feel like we have a lot of not to cover, but I'm going to try to move quickly through this. For those of you who have entrusted your life to Jesus and you have committed to following him and his ethical approach to life and even his radical view of love, okay, what's the name of the game for us then? Well, it's to understand very clearly, again, what he is saying about these things. But then what is the name of the game in terms of living out this ethic or trying to influence ethical change in the culture or trying to represent that out into the culture? And I would say a couple things here first. I would say first and foremost, we need to be always extremely committed to cleaning up our own testimony to Jesus and his self-sacrificing love and faithfulness towards one another. And what I mean by that is that sometimes when I hear, again, church at large, I'm not talking specifically about our church here or anything like that, but at church at large, sometimes it seems to me that the church at large is, more worked up about the homosexual agenda, the agenda to normalize homosexual activity and the LGBTQ agenda or whatever, than we are about the efforts to normalize no-fault divorce in our culture. Or maybe, sometimes it seems like the church might be just more concerned about homosexual sin that's happening out there than we are about the rampant abuse of pornography that's taking place in the church and among church leaders. Or maybe, maybe people in the church would be all bent out of shape about, two teenage men or two teenage boys, whatever, who are hugging and showing displays of physical affection. And they'd be more bent out of shape about that than they would about, a guy or a girl teenage. Heterosexual couple who are hugging and showing signs of physical affection for fear of what that might lead to. In other words, look. Here's what I'm getting at. When Jesus looks at the United States of America, and he considers the sexual activity of the United States of America. If you ask, well, I'm quite certain that the thing that displeases, that distresses, and that grieves the heart of Christ most is not the homosexual sin of the culture, but it's the heterosexual sin that's still rampant in the church. Right? Let me say that again, because I think for whatever reason, I get the impression the church has that differently, that when Jesus looks down at the American society, he is just deeply grieved about the homosexual activity. But I'm thoroughly convinced that what grieves the heart of Jesus more is not the homosexual activity of the culture, but the heterosexual sin within the church. And that's what we need to be most concerned about. We're the representation. We're the witnesses. We're the representers of Christ. We're the ones that Jesus is coming to first, always coming to first, and say, you represent me. You show me out there. Of course the culture is engaged in who knows what because they don't know me. You represent me. So first and foremost, make sure you're cleaning house and you're representing me and my self-giving, self-sacrificial, lifelong, faithful love. And you're not going at love and relationships and sexuality as acts of self-fulfillment and self-pleasure, all that, but you're doing it the way I do it. Okay? Okay, but then the other thing is, I think the name of the game for us is always, when we consider the outside culture and whatever they're engaged in, whatever they're doing, and we're thinking about influencing them or impacting change, the name of the game ought always to be to bring them to Jesus. Okay? Not only do we represent Jesus, but the name of the game for us is to always to bring the outside culture to Jesus. Sometimes, two misnomers I think we easily fall into. One is thinking that maybe what makes our nation a Christian nation would be that somehow we would all adhere to Christian ethical standards or the Old Testament law, or to Christian moral principles. Right? And we want to remember what we should all know, that adherence to Christian ethical principles in no way makes a nation a Christian nation. At best, it makes us a nation of Pharisees. That's exactly what the Pharisees were aiming after. What would make for a Christian nation is that you have us collectively recognizing our need for Jesus, recognizing our need for his forgiveness, his mercy, his love, and we come to him in confession, and we come to him in faith, and we come to him in dependence upon him and what he's done, on his life-giving Spirit, right? Again, the goal is always to bring them to Jesus first and foremost. I think another misnomer is that we sometimes think, well, the way we'll affect ethical change is we just tell people, hey, whatever you're doing is wrong, you need to stop it. Which there might be a time and a place for that, but I'm learning with 3 near teenage daughters that doesn't always work. Because there are heart issues involved here. It's not just a matter of, oh, he's told me I'm wrong, well, I should change it. No, there's a heart issue here. There's a misplaced worship. There's crowning something else in their life as of supreme importance. So what needs to happen in their lives? They need to come to see Jesus. They need to come see Jesus as a being infinitely of greater worth than whatever it is they're bowing the knee to and submitting their life to here and now. Which is all to say, again, I think when we think about this issue and how would we affect change, how would we reach into the culture, first and foremost, our desire is always to bring people to Jesus, to show them Jesus, show them his greatness, his worth, show them the radical nature of his love as exemplified on the cross. All right, so 2 questions I would ask. Here's a question for us to ask. Do we love and serve our neighbor? Do we aim for the well-being of our neighbor with sufficient passion and enthusiasm such that when they consider us and when they consider Christianity and when they consider Jesus Christ himself, do they say, well, I don't know if I agree or disagree with that, but one thing I know for sure, they sure do love us the way Jesus apparently does. Or when we live out publicly our testimony in a public arena and we represent Christ and what it means to be a follower of Jesus, do we make explicitly clear that our overriding fundamental mission is to present the love of Jesus as embodied on the cross? Or does the outside culture think that our fundamental mission is to present just sort of some ethical standard that we want them to conform to, like the Pharisees did, right? Just asking some questions here. Or, the simple basic question is, when the outside culture looks in, do they see a very clear ethical statement from us, or do they see very clearly the love of Christ as demonstrated on the cross? This love of Christ that didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Again, a whole lot more we could talk about. Here's the last thing, though, I promise. You might come back and say, as I'm tempted to think myself, well, wait a second, though. Jesus speaks very loudly and very boldly about sexual ethical issues. And he seems to come down pretty hard on these issues. So, isn't there a place for that? Shouldn't we be doing that? And I would just say two things in relation to that. First of all, take note of who he's talking to. He's always talking to the supposed insiders, the people within the community who think that they are representing the kingdom. He's very rarely, if ever, talking about, the weird sexual ethics going on in the pagan Roman Empire. He's always talking about in-house. He's always aiming at the in-house people and how they represent this kingdom. But more than that, the other thing you notice what Jesus is doing, he talks a pretty big game about these things. Almost so, and he always makes everybody uncomfortable. Like in this scenario, he's saying, let no one separate what man is joined together, and anybody who divorces, for reasons apart from adultery, right, commits adultery, and the Pharisees are getting a little hot under the collar. Or you think about when he's having the conversation with his disciples, and he says to them, you have heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I tell you, if you even look lustfully at a woman, you've already guilty of adultery. Oh, shoot, the disciples. Or to, when everybody's gathered around wanting to stone the prostitute for her sexual infidelities, and Jesus draws a line in the sand and says, hey, okay, let anybody who is without sin, go ahead, you cast the first stone, I'll get out of the way. And everybody says, and they just back up. In other words, what is Jesus doing? For lack of a better term, I think he's leveling the playing field. And he's essentially saying, guys, look, don't you all get it? All of you are fundamentally flawed and broken. All of you suffer from this hardness of heart condition that leads you to be fundamentally broken in areas of sexuality and relationship and life-giving, self-sacrificing love. All of you, which is essentially to say, and it ain't going to work by you all trying to conform to your moral standards. At the end of the day, you all need me. You all need the mercy and the grace and the forgiveness that I'm showing to you. You all need to be joined to me, united to me, and receive the life-giving power of my Spirit if you are going to live into the joy and the freedom that God has called you, invited you into. Again, I think it's just Jesus. What is he trying to do in all these conversations? Is to bring them back to himself, which has been the goal here this morning. Hopefully we attained it in some measure. To those on the outside looking in, who are concerned about what's coming out of Christianity, who Jesus is, my concern for you, see Jesus, understand him, look at who he is, look at his conversations, look at how he conducts his life, look at how radically different his whole approach to life is. Consider that. Consider if that might be worthwhile. And to those committed to him, committed to following him, it's three things. One, we clean up our own act in terms of being faithfully representing him. We aim at, above all things, bringing people to Jesus first and foremost, and to see them find life in him, and maybe him rework and refine and produce change in their lives. And three, in full humility, we stay desperately clinging to him as well, recognizing that we are just as flawed and broken as anybody on the outside and desperately in need of the mercy and the life that Jesus gives. And we would pray that as we do those three things, maybe our own kids grow up with a greater desire to know Jesus and be more like him. And maybe these future generations would also look at the church and look at Christianity and look at Jesus and see his love and see his radically different way of going at life and perhaps be curious and perhaps have a stirring desire to be more like him and to submit their life and their desires and their identities to him and what he would want to do in and through them. All for his kingdom's sake. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.